Hi, this is Dr. Maggie Perry with Tell Me What You're Proud Of. I'm here with Dr. Christina Pascarzi. Christina is a clinical psychologist in private practice in Oakland, California. She focuses on anxiety disorders and OCD. Christina, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And so thank you for listening to my sessions with Nicole. So can we start with just telling me what your impressions were of the sessions?
Sure. Well, my first impression was that Nicole came to therapy like many of my clients, which is that she began with a crisis in her life that kind of led her to feel like it was reaching the bar of starting therapy. And then when she worked through that with you, she kind of decided to look at some of the other areas of her life, like work and relationships, and to kind of think about how she was relating to those areas of her life and see how she could improve.
Yeah, I totally agree. A lot of people start therapy because they're in crisis and are kind of maybe thinking that once the crisis passes that they might want to stop. And it always makes me happy to see that people want to continue to look at themselves and face other areas of their life, or not just face them, but maybe look to find more effective ways of relating. So I appreciate both helping people through acute periods of suffering and then also helping them explore other areas of their life.
Yeah, it's two really different types of work. And I also really appreciate it when people kind of want to stick around and dig a little bit deeper. And it seemed like from the topics that you covered that Nicole is making just really incredible use of therapy. It sounds like she's very engaged, very self-reflective, and very open to thinking about how she responds to her thoughts, to her feelings, and to different situations in her life, and kind of being flexible about changing that so that she can, feel like she's doing better in those areas.
Yeah, I agree. And I just want to comment on what it means to make good use of therapy. I think there's some forms of therapy the therapist will be much less directive and kind of encourage the client themselves to explore, primarily be doing the exploring, and maybe the therapist is just guiding. And then there's more directive forms of therapy where the therapist might be working pretty hard to help the person get better. Yeah, help the person get better. I like to see my work as like a blend in between, where the client certainly has to be willing, and it's ideal when they're looking to observe their mind and not just get relief from the content of what they're suffering from at the time, so the themes that are causing them suffering, but also they're really curious about the processes that maintain their suffering, and they can generalize those processes to other times. And so I think that does take quite a bit of work on the client's side too, where I can do my best to listen to what's occurring, pattern match it to other people that I've worked with, and try to get out in front of what might happen next. But it's really the client that is not only being vulnerable about what's happening in their mind and body, but also taking that leap of faith and choosing to change and choosing to allow the growing pains that come with that. And that takes a lot of willingness. Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think what jumped out at me is what you said about curiosity and how important it is to be able to cultivate curiosity, and also how challenging that is, because when you're feeling a lot of distress, when you're feeling a lot of fear or uncertainty, or if there's an area of your life that you are not feeling good about or feeling self-critical about, it can be really hard to kind of diffuse or, step back from those feelings and try to create space for compassion and curiosity. But I think that's so important, because I think that's where the flexibility comes in. I think, when we kind of just stop at the negative feelings or kind of spiral into them, it's different from just acknowledging them and validating them. They can kind of take over. But if we can get to a place where we can acknowledge our suffering, validate why we're feeling that way, but also have a little bit of wiggle room where we're inviting some curiosity about it, then we have an opportunity to relate to those feelings differently, and hopefully more effectively, or in a way that allows us to really attend to them and take care of ourselves. But I think the challenge, and I remember Nicole mentioning this, is catching it, is really kind of noticing when you're in that moment and you're having a difficult feeling and kind of catching that that's happening so that you can use a tool that will help.
Yeah, is there anything in particular that helps you help people become more curious or respond to their own notice their self-criticism more quickly?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it always feels great, when we can catch it in the moment. It's always nice, you're kind of like, oh, I caught it this time, like, good for me, like I can do something about it. But I think so often it really starts with noticing afterwards, oh, I just kind of went down a rabbit hole, like I could have done this, and maybe next time I'll catch it. But I think what helps people to do that more often is to engage in some kind of deliberate practice with self-compassion. And I really see self-compassion and curiosity as very much, they go hand in hand. And so a lot of my clients, I will suggest start some kind of a regular daily, even if it's just 5 minutes, self-compassion practice or meditation practice around self-compassion, which kind of sets the tone for their day. And it kind of just puts in mind the option to approach things with self-compassion. And I think the more we engage in deliberate practice of the ways that we want to respond to ourselves, then the more accessible those ways of responding become in the harder moments.
Totally agree with you. Are there times where you get pushback about self-compassion?
Yes.
Yeah,
It's been a long road to hoe with self-compassion. I've been to several Kristen Neff trainings, which is where I first learned about self-compassion. And she talks a lot about how self-compassion can be sometimes confused with self-pity, with complacency. I think there's a lot of fear that self-compassion will actually keep you stuck, that it'll kind of, people sometimes say, like, let you off the hook, and then you won't really get to where you want to be going. But in actuality, self-compassion creates more openness and more flexibility to problem solve, to think about your options. Whereas I think of self-criticism as kind of like a dead end or like a cul-de-sac. It's like, well, I'm such an idiot because I, screwed up that presentation. It's like, well, if that's true, I guess there's nowhere to go, sometimes clients and I will kind of joke about that. It's like, well, if you think you're an idiot, it's like, oh, well, that really is like a hard stop. It's like, what are you supposed to do with that? But if you can, go ahead.
Yeah. So besides mindfulness-based practices, how do you teach people to have self-talk that's more compassionate?
Well, definitely practicing it in session. And even kind of role playing it and finding the language that fits for them. Some of the language that people hear on meditations can feel a little bit too flowery, I guess. And so they kind of have to find their own voice that feels authentic. And it's not just like, you're great, you're kind of like a general way of praising yourself. It's more about empathy and saying, like, I really understand how I'm feeling right now. And it helps people to kind of think about the language they would use with a friend, which I think you and Nicole were also talking about, and just kind of thinking about what kind of support would I give to a friend? How would I say it? Like, what really feels authentic? And sometimes we even role play that, and I'll give examples of how I might say, use self-compassion, and then I'll also invite clients to say what they think they might say in that moment. And it's, I think, helpful because sometimes that reveals that people aren't quite sure what to say and they have to kind of spend some time thinking about what feels genuine to them.
Totally agree. I think a cue that there's self-criticism going on when people are looking to notice where that's showing up in their lives is the word should. Do you have thoughts about the word should?
Yeah, absolutely. When clients are using the word should a lot, for example, if they are talking about maybe like a past relationship that was not a healthy one, or a job that they were in that they felt they should have left sooner. I often hear them say, like, I should have done this and I should have done that. And I will ask them to pause and to try to reframe that by saying, I wish I would have left this job sooner, or I wish I would have gotten out of this relationship sooner, so that the attention is on acknowledging that they wished that they had not been in that situation because they actually really care about themselves and they wish that they hadn't experienced what they experienced past a certain point. And it also helps to helps the client to notice that there are other feelings underneath the blame. So when you're kind of saying should a lot, you're focusing on, I did this wrong or I did that wrong, and you're not noticing that there might be sadness or grief or compassion for yourself about what you went through. And I think the other thing is that when we say should, we're kind of rewriting history with what we know now, and we're really not taking into consideration where we were, what we were experiencing in that moment, and how we were making decisions in that moment. And so making that shift from I should have to I wish I would have is kind of a, I think, compassionate shift to focus on, like, what were you really feeling? Like, what do you wish had been different for you?
Yeah, I like to say that everybody's doing the best they can with the information they have at the time. So it's a really
Yeah.
similar topic. Thank you for that. I like everything that you're describing. Another thing that I see that holds people back from compassion is clinical perfectionism. Do you want us, and basically getting stuck in, if I let go of my perfectionistic standards, then I'm not going to be able to maintain the excellence that I expect out of myself. And you started to say a little bit about how people are afraid that they won't be able to, they'll have to drop their standards, but I'm wondering if you have other thoughts about clinical perfectionism.
Well, I think a lot of what I know about clinical perfectionism I learned from you, so I don't know if this will be a review. But I think there's a difference between the ideal of wanting to do well, or the value of wanting to do well, and the strategy, as you've often called it, of perfectionism, which is kind of an ineffective strategy to try to do well at something that you care about. Yeah, I'm trying to think. I did have a thought about that from her session.
I can also jump off from here if you want.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so I definitely see perfectionism as being a problem of strategy, not of outcome. And I really appreciate everything you were saying about how compassion opens us up to curiosity and kind of learning from our mistakes. And I think I would just take it to the next point that I would make about it is, for those minds that are basically constantly coming up with a strategy that they think would be perfect, it often becomes rigid and narrow and not flexible, inflexible. And so it's not just helping people understand that they're not gonna have to drop their standards, but it's also even trying to help them understand that their outcomes might even be better. So the type of person that is rigidly following rules, if you can relax into the uncertainty of not following the rule, you might find that there's actually other solutions to whatever problem you're trying to solve, and you can delegate to other people or collaborate with other people, and then your outcome is actually better. So you're not saying, well, if I'm not perfectionistic, then I just don't care. It's really saying that striving to rigidly follow rules, or thinking that every mistake is catastrophic, thinking that everything is as important as everything else, repeating things until they feel just right. These are all aspects of clinical perfectionism that tend to actually make people's performance lower. And people that engage in those kind of behaviors actually tend to procrastinate more. Like procrastination and perfectionism are two sides of the same coin. So the way to fight perfectionism would be to try to prioritize things that you value. Like, not everything is as important as everything else, and some things can be done at 50% or 75%. To experiment, to take risks rather than rigidly following rules, to watch out for diminishing returns. So when you're doing something for so long that you're no longer getting the outcome that you're wanting, or, the difference between 97% and 100% is like not necessarily worth it.
Yeah.
And then also using like conscientious models. So using other people whose work ethic you value or whose performance you value as a barometer for when you might be able to stop or reprioritize certain tasks. Those are all things that come to mind for me related to perfectionism.
Yeah, all of that makes sense to me, and it's reminding me of a part of your session. I think it was in the first session with Nicole, where you were asking her, like, when did she first start to notice, ways that her mind is working differently from other people that before she didn't realize was unique to her. And she brought up the example of work and work assignments or work presentations that she would spend a lot of time preparing for, so much so that she might neglect, social time or exercise or things like that. And I thought that was such a good example of how worry can trick us when we are aware that something is important to us. And it's, was very clear that doing well at work was important to her. She really cared about, doing well in these presentations or projects. But worry kind of tricks us and says, well, if this is important to you, why aren't you working on it constantly, And it kind of brings that urgency up. And it can actually feel kind of scary to step away from that, it can feel like an exposure, to take a way of thinking about it from anxiety work, can feel like an exposure to take a step away from rehearsing the presentation and to go for a run. And I think that it's really great that she was brave and kind of flexible to try some of those strategies and to step away from it and to see that her performance was probably as good or even better because she was doing these other self-care things that were not just about kind of staying on that track of rehearsing or reviewing.
Yeah, I totally agree that she offered a great example of diminishing returns.
Yeah.
And I think the paradox here and for many people is that they're afraid to give up the uncertainty of it. So if they have something due or a presentation coming up, many perfectionists will prepare until the last minute, feeling like it's too uncertain to not continue to prepare, when in fact, if you instead give yourself time to rest, to do other self-care behaviors, you're more likely to be able to work in the same way or engage in whatever activity that you're doing perfectionistically. You're more able to do that at a high level in the long term. So I think actually, to summarize, there's kind of two different topics we're discussing here. One of them is noticing your self-criticism and treating yourself with more compassion, especially when you're thinking that you're making mistakes where you might not even be making mistakes. You might just be learning and growing. And the other one is watching out in your behavior for when your behavior is anxiety-driven and perfectionism-driven, where you're having trouble not doing things in a rigid way or doing things too urgently.
Yeah, those are great points.
Great. So the other thing that Nicole and I talked quite a bit about was like mood tracking and just self-monitoring in general. Did you have any thoughts about that part of our sessions?
Yeah, it sounded like it was really helpful for her, and that it really helped her make the connection that her sort of narrative about what was happening in her life could be really impacted by her mood. I think one of the examples she gave was like if she goes on a date and it kind of doesn't go anywhere, she might have one narrative about it if her mood is generally positive and stable, and a really different narrative about it if her mood was low. And I think that's true for many people. And it can be, subtle, or it can be really drastic, like how much our minds change how we see things. And so I liked that she made that connection. I thought that was great. And she had a kind of a solution to help her notice when her mood was kind of shifting, the tracking of, I think, alcohol, exercise, and sleep. So that seemed like it was a pretty good strategy for her, although sometimes it can be hard to be consistent with it. But it seemed like that was one tool that she was using to kind of stay on track with that. And then I think the other thing that she brought up was around, knowing that if she's in a certain feeling, that it could just be a feeling in response to something, not necessarily a mood shift. And so in those cases, it's more about, maybe not all these self-care habits, but more just about attending to that particular feeling and not saying, this is who I am now, or this is how it is now. Yeah.
I like your language there. For both. And how do you distinguish between emotions or feelings and mood? And can you say more about that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think for me, it has to do with whether there is a particular trigger that the person can point to, and also how long and through what different experiences the feeling lasts. So if I ever notice that I've had a shift in mood, sometimes I'll try to pause and think back to, when did I last feel good before this feeling that I'm having now? And I'll try to see, like, was there something that happened that I can identify? Was there a conversation or, something that occurred that I was like, oh, I think that's now why I might be feeling this. So I encourage clients to try to really, pause, to acknowledge what the feeling is, and to try to see if there's a reason that they might have been feeling that way. And I really try to encourage clients to I say, like, give yourself the benefit of the doubt, like, assume that there's a good reason for what you're feeling, as opposed to saying, like, oh, why am I feeling this way? Or why am I feeling that way? Or, like, I shouldn't be feeling this way. To kind of just say, like, if I assumed there was a good reason for this, why might I be feeling this way? And if you really can't think of anything that's happened that might have triggered that feeling, then you might, look at, okay, maybe there's just a mood shift here that's not related to anything that's really going on, but it could be related to just general stress, or it could be because I'm kind of off track with my self-care routine. So I think length of time and kind of what other factors can you look at to see what might have been contributing to it can be helpful to kind of distinguish between those two. But I'm curious, how you think about it, because maybe it's different.
Yeah, no, I think everything that you just said was really great. The other thing that I was just thinking is, if you have a certain internal or external trigger, then you're having a feeling, you're having trouble catching the feeling, and you respond in an emotion-driven way, then those behaviors over time could also trigger a mood state. So that we see that, like, commonly with depression. So for instance, if being in quarantine and isolated from others makes you feel sad and lonely, and then in the presence of sadness and loneliness, you withdraw from other people through Zoom or on the phone, and you kind of ruminate a lot, you watch TV a lot, you listen to certain music that brings your mood down and causes more and more rumination, you could then start having thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that kind of reinforce depression and make that stronger. So that's one example where a feeling can trigger a mood state, and then the mood state kind of reinforces itself. Is that consistent with what you think?
Yeah, that's a great point. I don't think I've put it together in that way, but that's actually really helpful framing of just how, if you're not responding to it in a way that feels helpful or compassionate or effective, it can kind of segue into that mood state, and that can last much longer than just the original feeling that you were having.
Yeah, and then that brings us back to why compassion towards our feelings is such a good strategy. Because if, while you're experiencing suffering, you have a compassionate response, you look towards it with curiosity, and then you get curious about what your needs are. So loneliness can be a cue that you need to connect. So rather than a less mindful response that might be rumination and withdrawal, if in the presence of loneliness you think, this is a moment of suffering, it's really painful for me to be experiencing this, is there someone I can connect with that would reduce this feeling? That kind of effective strategy might prevent the feeling from becoming a mood.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Like, the compassion and the slowing down allows you to really recognize, like, what the specific feeling is, and then you can choose a coping response that actually fits that feeling and attends to that feeling. And I think when people don't slow down, or they kind of try to maybe rush to try to feel better without really thinking about what it is that they're feeling, sometimes they can choose a coping response that just kind of doesn't quite fit with what they're feeling. And then it kind of triggers a whole cycle of shame. So like some people will talk to me about, maybe binge eating or watching, TV all day or something like that as a response to feeling lonely or feeling upset. And we always talk about how there's nothing inherently wrong with, treating yourself to some cookies or watching a show you enjoy. But if it's not actually fitting the feeling like of loneliness, then you're still going to feel lonely, and you've kind of missed an opportunity to really attend to that feeling in a compassionate way. So it's like maybe you call a friend and maybe you also get a treat, but you have to call the friend because that's what fits that feeling.
That's a great example. Thank you so much for that. In awareness of our time, is anything else coming to mind for you?
No, I just really appreciate, getting to consult with you about it, and Nicole's willingness to, do a couple of the sessions on the podcast. And it was really great to just hear your interaction and how she's making use of therapy. And I wish her the best in her continued work.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here and for the consultation. Thanks.
Okay, bye.